KMO Show, episode number 33, prepared for release on Sunday, July 6th, 2025.
All watched over by machines of loving grace. I like to think, and the sooner the better, of a cybernetic meadow where mammals and computers live together in mutually programming harmony, like pure water touching the clear sky. I like to think, right now please, of a cybernetic forest filled with pines and electronics, where deer stroll peacefully past computers as if they were flowers with spinning blossoms. I like to think it has to be of a cybernetic ecology where we are free of our labors and joined back to nature, returned to our mammal brothers and sisters, and all watched over by machines of loving grace.
All right, well, that is Peter Clarke introducing the topic of today's discussion. Peter, it's good to talk to you again.
Oh yeah, great to be here.
So I'm assuming most people listening are on Substack, and your bio and body of work are just a click away. So we'll keep introductions minimal, but I will say that this conversation was sparked by a recent post of yours in which you compared the visions for post-liberal governance of Balaji Srinivasan and Curtis Yarvin and wondered if they were compatible. So the first part of this discussion won't be much of a discussion because you have a whole bunch of groundwork to lay. Before we can discuss this topic, you need to introduce it as thoroughly as you think necessary, and I'm going to mute my microphone and turn a fan on because it's hot.
Okay, yeah, I feel you. Yeah, summertime. So it's kind of interesting to me that you called it like a post-liberal world, and a lot of people are. I mean, anyone who's kind of like in any sort of a reactionary camp, whether they're on the right or on the left, they are drawn to anything that is broadly, under the umbrella of post-liberalism. And there are two particular camps of this world that are just like popular, like kind of like internet popular, and they aren't naturally very cohesive, but the same sorts of people are gravitated towards them, including JD Vance is a fan of both. So, one is network states and the other is the so-called dark Enlightenment. And so I wanted to kind of explore this topic in that, really actually like look into, are these compatible at all or not, or are people just latching onto something because they're like equally trendy and equally post-liberal? Before I get to my conclusion about that, I will ramble a little bit about what each is, kind of to quickly introduce them, I guess. Let me start with network states. So there is this guy, Balaji Srinivasan, who is, I think he was like the, IT head for Coinbase. He's just kind of like a Silicon Valley guy. And he wrote this book a number of years ago, I think in 2020 or around that time, about this concept of network states that he kind of developed. And it is a kind of like simple concept where people just form communities online, then they with the explicit intention of starting a state, they will just form online, but then they will, through collective action, they will start to pool resources and then actually acquire some real territories. And the goal is to eventually actually become recognized internationally as a state. I mean, at some level, it is kind of a pipe dream, and it sounds like just like something a sci-fi author would come up with. But this guy is actually taking real steps to kind of make this happen. So he has some sort of like a university thing that people have been going to. I don't know. I don't know the extent of what he's done, but it also is tied into a little bit of the seasteading movement, where people are trying to develop communities out in the middle of the ocean or right off the coast of certain countries, so that they don't have to abide by any sort of local laws. So there is some actual on the ground work stuff happening with this. Also, it's very connected to the world of cryptocurrency, because any of these new network states, they wouldn't necessarily have to start a new currency. They would just use some sort of a crypto. So there's a lot to be said about this. But one thing that I think is kind of interesting is that I gave a talk one time about how artists could take advantage of this. And this is maybe, I think in my mind, one of the most practical applications is communities of artists forming a sort of collective where they don't just have the idea of we're going to hang out online, but to make it more tangible, more real world than that. So imagine a group of artists, like, a global group of artists, but they all have the same sort of goals and ambitions in mind. And so they start to pool their resources, and then maybe they just, like, in certain cool cities around the world, maybe like London or Paris and San Francisco and LA, they just, rent out a block in each one of those cities. And then those particular artists at any given time can go crash and hang out and make art and party in these cool cities, and they're all like hanging out together, and it forms a like super powerful collective. Something like that I think is kind of cool, and probably actually does happen for the uber wealthy, right? But this would be something that maybe like the normies could take advantage of if you pooled enough resources. Okay, so that's network states in a nutshell. The other world here that I was looking at is the Dark Enlightenment. And I think most people by now are probably pretty familiar with Curtis Yarvin. He was the blogger Mencius Moldbug, and he also is a Silicon Valley guy. And he has been writing about this concept of, I don't know. There's the only way to say it is that he's a monarchist. He wants to run governments as if like the president were a CEO. This has been his conception for a while, and he's written like a ton about this. He actually did not come up with the term Dark Enlightenment. This guy Nick Land took some of Yarvin's writings and eventually like came up with this idea that like, oh, this is the Dark Enlightenment, and it's very like it's like super like post-liberal. You almost might want to call it like a type of conservatism, because it is like very like kind of like backwards looking and subversive in a lot of ways. And a lot of it does rub people very much the wrong way, aside from monarchism. I don't want to get too much into that necessarily, because it might just be like a sidebar. But yeah, so the Curtis Yarvin idea is very, very popular among Silicon Valley types, even if it's just like a hobby horse sort of popularity. But a lot of people are so frustrated with the government because it is so slow, so clunky. We see what China's doing, just like, being able to build stuff at a rapid pace, and we just can't, for the life of ourselves, build anything. And, the flagship example here is the California high-speed rail. Has been like billions and billions of dollars and has gotten nowhere. What we need, they say, is some sort of a CEO, powerful type leader who can just make things happen. And Curtis Yarvin does have some real world examples of like, why can't we just have, like Lee Kuan Yew, so someone like who's parallel to Lee Kuan Yew, the guy who basically developed Singapore out of nothing. Or we've had past presidents in the United States who were effectively that powerful, at least for a certain small periods of time. So there are real world examples, even in the modern age, where people have had that sort of power, and it just freaks people out because it's not democratic. To kind of like tie it back together, a lot of people in Silicon Valley, including JD Vance himself, are interested in both network states and the Dark Enlightenment. And no one that I can really tell until my article has really asked the question of like, are these compatible? Can these coexist?
All right. Well, I'm going to add a couple of things just to the introductory remarks. One is I think it's helpful in this instance to put Nick Land way off to the side and even discount, the whole notion of the Dark Enlightenment. Because while Mencius Moldbug and Nick Land, their ideas mingled as they solidified, Nick Land is way out there. Very speculative and a very like future, like transhumanist. He's looking further down the track, and he is even more divorced from mundane human concerns than Yarvin is. And I think it's best just to set Land to the side. But with Yarvin, I think an argument for his point of view that I know you're not advocating for it, so it wasn't incumbent upon you to mention it, but just the basis of his thinking is that electoral democracy introduces perverse incentives to the management of a large organization like a nation state, in that a CEO who is beholden on, the favorable view of the populace over short periods, between elections, can't really do anything that doesn't pay off immediately. If there's something that requires some short-term pain and discipline for benefits that unfold more than one or two electoral cycles in the future, it's just off the table. Whereas a king who's there for life and who has hereditary skin in the game, one of his sons hopefully won't be an idiot and will assume control after his death, so he can think and is inclined to think in a much more long-term fashions. You say that both Balaji Srinivasan and Curtis Yarvin have the same group of fans, basically, even though, or their fans come from the same sort of tech libertarian, demographic, that they seem kind of incompatible. But And this, my Substack is Gen X science fiction and futurism. So we're talking about, the future and possible organizations of, changes of organization in nation state dynamics in the near future. But you ask, are these two systems compatible with one another? And there is a very well-known sci-fi vision that describes exactly this state of network states coexisting with other types of like top-down states where the membership is not optional. So the network states want to recruit high agency, high net worth individuals and corral them into these high agency organisms and also free themselves of the burden of the low agency masses. So different rules should apply to the people who matter, and effective mechanisms should be used to care for and custode the low agency masses. So the vision, the sci-fi vision, the novel that really shows this at work is The Diamond Age by Neil Stephenson.
Oh, yeah.
In The Diamond Age, you have essentially network states. You have like franchise nations. And the one that is biggest in, is most central in The Diamond Age is the Victorians. So these are people who model themselves after the ethos and the style of Victorian England, but they have physical enclaves all over the world. But these are very high agency people. They're very wealthy. They employ an artisan caste to make, handmade everything for them. Whereas most of the people, who have no agency and are just governed, as a matter of necessity by these other institutions, they get everything from essentially replicators. It's like 3D printing, but the mechanism by which this is delivered is extremely constrained. You can't be creative with the things that your printer makes because, they don't want the people who depend on the state to have that sort of creative power. So, you have pre-programmed options that you can get, toys and such for children, food items, things like that come through this feed, this infrastructure of, precursor feedstock. Like everybody's got a 3D printer in their house, but you don't buy the ingredients from which your items are printed. They just come to you through this infrastructure that's like, plumbing. The contents of that plumbing are strictly controlled to prevent people from being creative or, trying to use that technology to increase their own power and agency in the world. And the two models seem incompatible in that the network states are going to be tried to headhunt basically the high agency individuals who would be the natural leaders of Yarvan's monarchical CEO type states. So it seems that there's a tension there. But, Neil Stephenson has shown us a world in which the two systems are operating side by side. And it's just the quality of life is so much lower in, the monarchical state than it is in the network states, which are, voluntary in their citizenship and, they compete with one another for the really desirable individuals. Like one of the characters in The Diamond Age is a playwright who is a recent convert to the Victorian distributed state, and he had been headhunted by the state because they were looking to beef up their stable of artists and artistic, not just talent, but I think clout as well. So anyway, there's a vision of the two operating together. But let's go back to the tension between the two. I mean, I've mentioned both systems want high agency individuals. In the network state, it's so that the same rules that apply to the masses don't have to apply to the really good people. And in Yarvan's vision, you need to give control to high agency people. And if they've all fled to the network states, that doesn't really work. But
yeah,
what else?
To flesh out how I conceive of this a little bit, because the Diamond Age book is actually a great example of that. I hadn't thought about that. That's a perfect example. So the way that I look at this, you totally can have network states that adopt a Yarvan style powerful CEO. You can't do it the other way around though. You can't start with a powerful CEO Yarvan style and then have that operate as a network state. It just wouldn't work that way. So you can have both visions, but it has to start first with having network states that want to have a powerful CEO. And kind of to Yarvan's credit, just a teeny bit, he doesn't necessarily say we have to have a true monarch, someone who we only get the successor through like childbirth. He just wants someone who is able to act as a monarch, like FDR style, even though like FDR eventually stepped down and passed power on to the next president. He, during his term, he was a guy who served 4 terms. He effectively was the Yarvan vision for what he would like to see in America. at least maybe a watered down version of, but that is that. So in a sense, it's not quite as crazy as it sounds that he just like, oh, wants a monarch, because that is kind of like an old fashioned thing. He wants a modern version of that. The problem is that he doesn't flesh it out in a way that makes anybody feel all that comfortable with it, especially like a normal lib is just not going to feel very comfortable, particularly in a world where the default would-be king is Donald Trump, who just like rubs so many people the wrong way. He's just like so unlikable to like half the population. So we're not living in a world, I think, that could, make the normie lib be excited about this vision, but it's not quite as insane as it might come off at first blush. I lost track of where we're a little bit. Where do you want me to go from here?
Well, what about the competition for elite human capital between the two systems?
Okay, yeah.
What are your thoughts there?
So I do think that if you have a network state and it is flourishing, it is going to attract a lot of high human capital. It's going to attract a lot of people who are entrepreneurs and visionaries. And also, I mean, part of the whole idea of the network state is that you don't necessarily automatically have to give up your citizenship to whatever other country you belong to. So I don't think that anybody would like burn their US passport to join a network state. But if you can hop into a network state, like that's going to attract a lot of people who want to maybe just avoid certain regulations for like, the next 10 years while they work on some startup or something like that. So yeah, that definitely attracts a lot of high human capital. But the Yarvin vision, I don't think it does. And maybe there's a way in which it could. But I mean, the way in which it could is that it would allow you to, if your project was deemed appropriate from the strong CEO figure, then you probably wouldn't face a lot of regulations. You could probably do whatever you wanted. You wouldn't have to worry about the consequences. But the moment your project was deemed unfavorable to the powerful monarch, he might just shut the whole thing down. And the way that very strong leaders operate throughout history, they do just shut a lot of things down. And that does not attract, historically, a lot of, high human capital. Although right now in today's modern age, all the people who are kind of like strong CEO types, they are, at least in this moment in history, very frequently pro tech. So, if the US all of a sudden tomorrow were to like give Donald Trump the free reign to do whatever he wanted, he would slash regulations and probably, but I don't even know, because like, in the world as it currently exists, Donald Trump is dismantling universities and not, like straight up saying we don't want any foreigners coming to our, to Harvard, and we're basically like turning away high human capital right now as we speak. I saw that like an article that Canada is all of a sudden getting like the smartest brains on the planet. No longer the people that would be going to the US are going to Canada. I like just woke up to my throat. So I do think that kind of in general, as a default, the network states are going to be more favorable to high human capital rather than the Yarvin style universe. It could just go wrong in so many ways in the Yarvin style government way.
So I want to point out that you have mentioned the name Donald Trump on multiple occasions on this call, and I have not said it once until this sentence. And that's because it is so easy for his personality and people's feelings about him to crowd out other considerations. And, Donald Trump, while of course he is one of the most powerful people in the world and certainly, one of the most visible and innovating or energizing for discussion, is not that interesting to me.
Mm-hmm.
I will admit, like this last time, it was the first time, but I voted for him just because the alternative was just so unpalatable. But it was not any sort of positive endorsement.
Mm-hmm.
Even though it kind of was, because normally I vote Libertarian. But the Libertarian candidate this time around was a bizarre choice for Libertarians. So do you remember, who was it? Chase Oliver? Is that his name?
Yeah, I was trying to think who it was. Yeah, you're right.
Yeah. I mean, by some weird fluke of Libertarian Party convention rules, he walked away with, the top prize. But like the top prize being the Libertarian candidate, maybe you'll get 1%. But anyway, not to get sidetracked on contemporary figures and personalities. The network state, it attracts high agency, high net worth individuals. One of the main attractions, I think, is that they don't want to pay taxes. And they certainly
Yes.
don't want to pay taxes to support huge populations of people who really aren't doing anything that they find at all worthy or interesting. So the notion of dual citizenship between, say, Yarvin's reworked notion of the United States and a digital Singapore is not going to be very attractive to the people who want to get out of paying taxes. And I hate to say it because it brings us back to contemporary politics, but it seems like one of the reasons to keep tax rates on the wealthiest individuals so low is so that they don't renounce their citizenship and just go live someplace else. Go ahead.
Yeah, that's a real possibility. If network states were to become super successful, and let's say, we're going into the future here, let's say that we do have a world where Jeff Bezos has a couple of pods, like free floating pods up in the sky, and maybe we've opened up Mars as a place where civilization can do a thing. If we're talking about like getting off planet, talk about being able to escape taxes. I mean, and the wealthy absolutely will take advantage of anything that they can to not have to pay taxes to make the subway in New York, run on time or whatever. That's just not in terms of like aligned with their day-to-day interests. So if you do play this out into the future, it's absolutely going to be driven by people trying to avoid taxes, I think. And this is why crypto is going to be such a big component here, because it's just so easy to avoid any sort of, governmental oversight the moment you're trading crypto rather than hard currency.
Well, crypto is another dangerous potential segue, but I've been, following Bitcoin since I don't even know, maybe 2012 or so is when I first started hearing people get really excited about it. And people who just don't care to think about it have been saying, well, it's going to go to zero. I'm thinking Peter Zion now, or they're going to ban it, which is what Jim Kunstler used to say, that it would be banned any day now. And, here we are with Bitcoin over 100,000 per coin, far higher than it was, when Peter Zion started saying that it was going to zero. It had only ever been propped up because of the largesse of the COVID era, just sending checks to everybody. People who didn't need that money just pumped it into crypto. This was his theory. And that now that that giveaway had ended, that Bitcoin was going to go to zero and be forgotten, which, didn't play out. But now Donald Trump and his family and his close associates are hoarding Bitcoin, Ethereum, and, the other big brand name tokens, blockchains, which says to me that it's not going anywhere. If people in the know with money are hoarding it, then government seems to be, one of the primary uses for government these days seems to be to buoy the price, the retail value of assets held by rich people, be it stocks or real estate or now crypto. Anyway, I said it's a dangerous topic because it's like something I can just free associate on for a while and not bring back to the main point. But the main point, I guess, for me in discussing your article with Chaffo, which is my personal version of ChatGPT 4.0, was that both Yarvin and Srinivasan really seem to base their visions on the notion that humans will be the prime decision makers and that they will be explicitly defining the governmental structures that govern, the flow of money and the deployment of resources and technology and civilization. That's not assured, as far as I can see. It seems like we're moving into a state where more and more human cognitive activity will be offloaded to artificial intelligence. Not in some grand renunciation of agency, but just out of convenience, a little bit at a time, outsourcing our thinking and our attention to these tireless devices or entities. And so I could well imagine a civilization, less than a decade from now, in which there's the appearance of lots of different competing, even antagonistic social systems, but it's all a charade. It's all just a shadow puppet play. Really, there is one system, and it's not even a government. There's just one, system of outsourced competence which keeps things running. And then the AI just presents the world differently to different people to let them, to give them the impression that they're living in whatever societal arrangement keeps them quiescent, keeps them out of trouble, basically. And for some people, the AI will say, yeah, you are living under the thumb of a totalitarian dictator and you absolutely must organize and resist. But then it will direct them to do so in utterly feckless ways, which, keeps them engaged emotionally, but really out of the way, which is just the goal. So I'll let you respond to that.
Yeah, well, I'm reminded of a YouTube video I watched yesterday. It was on this channel, Free Think, and the title of this was 2025, The End of Our World as We Know It. And this was a Peter Leiden talk. He was the guy who was like, way back in the day, he was part of Wired magazine. He's just been like a technologist over the years, a bit of a futurist. But it was interesting because he presents this, explanation for the recent past in terms of we have these 25-year cycles of rapid innovation followed by 80 years of stagnation. And so let me just kind of like very quickly summarize this because I think that it puts like a little bit of a timeline on where we might be headed, because this is very relevant to me, to what you were just saying about like what comes next, like looking at this from a historical perspective. So from 1787 to 1812, there was a founding age when we founded America, and there was a lot of innovation between that time. Then there was an 80-year cycle or 80-year span of not much happening. And then the Gilded Age hit in 1865, same thing, like a ton of innovation very rapidly, followed by another 80 years of stagnation. And then in 1945, it was a post-war era where we had globalization and, tons and tons and tons of rapid innovation. Then in 1970, there was stagnation again. And Peter Leiden says that the year 2025 right now is when this next cycle, this next period of rapid innovation is going to hit. And so we're going to have 25 years of everything just like accelerating beyond belief. And it's going to be driven by artificial intelligence, clean energy, and bioengineering in his view. And I think that he is totally right about this, because we do feel, I kind of felt that the moment the calendar year turned over, especially with like ChatGPT and everything that we're seeing in terms of bioengineering, it does feel like a tipping point has really just hit. And I think that, in terms of like the way that our governments are structured right now, they just don't make a lot of sense. If AI becomes even half as powerful as people are speculating that it might be, if bioengineering makes it so that we live, I don't know, 200, 300, 400 years, if we just tap into any sort of potential like that, that also will make it so the governments don't make sense as they're currently formatted. And then also clean energy. If we all of a sudden have energy abundance where it's totally free, and then we can do whatever we want in terms of like massive scale projects, because the bottleneck always is energy at some level, we're going to be living in a completely new world. And Peter Leiden says that the inevitable thing that's going to happen next over the next 25 years is we're going to have some sort of a one world government. And people have been talking about this for as long as I've been alive as like a scary thing. And it absolutely is scary, but the alternative might be slightly scarier. Peter Leiden doesn't flesh this out, but I've heard other people do it, so I'll do it kind of quickly. Is that like we could, right now, we can destroy ourselves with nuclear weapons and a couple of other things. But if this technology that we're talking about comes to fruition, there will be a whole platter of ways for us to literally destroy all of life on Earth. And so we will need some sort of a central global government to monitor the proliferation of bioweapons, of AI that could destroy the world, of, not to mention like nuclear weapons, et cetera. So like just to make it so we don't kill ourselves, we might have to have some sort of a centralized one world government to monitor behavior. So, and given all of that, the rogue states that could emerge in response probably would be some sort of like a network state. If all of a sudden like we are under the umbrella of a one world government that's super, super powerful, people might really want to connect with each other outside of that and form some sort of like a coherent like asset set that is however possible outside of that umbrella. And that would be some sort of a network state. But yeah, the one world government would be like the Yarvin style king. And then the rebels would be the Srinivas style network states. So, who knows what's going to happen in the next 25 years, but that is one vision.
Well, I guess maybe I'm drawing upon the Star Wars prequels a little bit, but the Clone Wars, Shri Palpatine was running both sides. He instigated the separatist movement and arranged for the construction of their droid army, and he also arranged for the construction or the creation of the clone army in secret, so that they would be ready for him to command when he is ascended to absolute power. And I don't anticipate. I don't look to Star Wars for any sort of forecasting or any sort of detailed political analysis. It's all very mythic. But the idea that I'm drawing on is that you have apparent conflict and apparent antagonism between forces, which is really just a managed presentation to distract from the actual mechanisms of governance, which are really quite mundane and boring, but people would object to if you told them that, no, it doesn't really matter who you vote for. The computers run everything anyway.
That's scary to us now, but I don't know. I could see that kind of changing in the future. We're just so used to humans running everything. But if your doctor's office is run by a robot, if the local DMV is run by robots, and this just starts going, further and further up the chain, and if all of a sudden our life purpose isn't tied to a 9-to-5 job anymore, we might just be like, that's a job. Like running the government, that's a job. People don't do jobs. That's what the robots do. They do the jobs and we just hang out. Who knows exactly how that could play out. But I talk about this a lot with this guy, Zoltan Istvan, who's running for governor of California. And I'm an advisor on his campaign. And he is really running with his vision that the scary vision that we're going to lose like 80% of jobs in the next 5 or 10 years. And then so we are going to have to like reimagine the purpose of government. And he is leaning into like, UBI as a thing that's going to like keep people afloat. And I developed this concept with him called the automated abundance economy, where we just like ground up re-envision how the economy is structured, where people live longer, people work less, and there is an abundance of energy and resources and wealth. And what does that start to look like? And this is like possibly near horizon sort of a thing, not even like 50 years from now, but this could be recent, and it may not happen. There are reasons why it totally might not happen like this, but I think that it is a good idea to start actually planning for it, because the worst case scenario is that all of a sudden, this is the sci-fi scenario that we should be worried about, in that only like the ultra wealthy take advantage of the new resources that open up from AI, and then 90% of the masses are just like impoverished and stuck that way because they can't work. So, right now is the correct time to start thinking about this in practical terms, in terms of like reimagining the government.
Yeah. What's his name? The AI superpower guy. Shoot. I've read 2 books by him. I can't bring his name to mind. Kai-Fu Lee.
Oh,
Yeah. Kai-Fu Lee followed up AI superpowers with another book, and it was AI and then the name of a year, and I forget the year, somewhere in mid-century. And it's told, he partnered with a sci-fi writer, and it's told as a series of, they're not even short stories because they don't really have the dramatic tension to be a story in most cases. But the little vignettes just with fictional characters describing the challenges of life in a world, transformed by artificial intelligence. And one of them is that, people just don't accept universal basic income. They don't accept being relegated to the status of an unproductive dependent, particularly when, there are people still working, and the people who are working, they kind of lord it over the ones who aren't. And it'll be a challenge not to, get, for the people whose cognitive abilities are still economically relevant, for them not to feel utterly superior to the people who are just on the dole, and who have no prospect of ever being relevant again. So, once the transformation is complete and everybody like nobody has a job, well, that's fine. That's one thing. But, when you go to Thanksgiving dinner and half the men at the table still have jobs, and they are really, down on those who don't, it's, psychologically, actually, that's a pretty untenable situation. It's going to be one that generates a lot of resentment and just a lot of antagonism. And so there's going to be a strong motivation to convince unproductive people that they're not just receiving charity, that what they're doing really is economically valuable and relevant. Women will have an easier time with this because, they've always been more like socially self-organizing than men. Men tend to need a sharper focus and a more defined role for themselves, and, a more sort of, they need clear metrics to demonstrate to themselves and others that they are being productive. And, the easiest one is just, look, I support a family. with my labor.
Mhm.
And when men don't have that anymore, things get ugly, particularly when young men don't have any way to feel relevant or fulfilled, or, to get the sense that they are moving through the stages of life that their fathers and grandfathers got to. Go ahead.
Yeah, well, I was gonna say my optimistic vision for this is that I don't think that people actually need jobs to satisfy themselves, even men. What we need is status games. And this
Yeah.
is why sports are so satisfying for men, because it is like an instant gratification sort of status game. And if we no longer, I mean, it might, imagine this, like you said, that like sitting around the dinner table and the people who have jobs are like the high status people versus the people who don't have jobs. What if it's kind of flipped and only like the low status people have jobs and everybody else is playing more, exciting versions of status games? Even like having a Substack account and like trying to grow your followers is a status game, right? And it's super satisfying, even though like hardly any of us make any money at this. So I think that there could be a massive proliferation of status games in the future. Ones that we haven't even envisioned yet could come online, and maybe you get compensated with crypto, or you get compensated with you're just joining new social groups where people have more social cred, sort of thing. One example of this that is so fascinating to me, I think about all the time. I read this book on status. It's just called Status by, I'm blanking on the author's name. It's a very boring name, so I kind of forget it. Will Storr. Yeah, Status by Will Storr. And he starts out his book talking about how there was this guy who was in England and he killed somebody when he was young, like very young, and he spent the next like 20, 30 years in prison. And then, but every time he could get out of prison, he sabotaged it so that he would not leave. And it was like a mystery for psychologists. Like, why in the world is this guy sabotaging himself so he doesn't like get out of prison? That's insane. But it wasn't insane, because he was at the pinnacle of the status game in prison, where he was like the prison's lawyer, and he was this and that, like the head of this committee, head of that committee. And so he was like the top dog. And he knew that the second he got out of prison, he would be the lowest of the low in terms of like societal status. And he would have to climb his way up from the very, very, very bottom. And so like, if you can get a healthy sense of status from being in prison, I think that you can in any given society, with or without jobs at the same time. So there are definitely ways I think that we can orient ourselves healthily, even without having any sort of jobs at all.
I'm reminded of two stories, one sci-fi, one not. The first is The Shawshank Redemption, and just think of Morgan Freeman as Red, stressing about being an institutional man because he'd spent decades in prison, and then he gets out and, he doesn't really know what to do. And somebody who had been in prison for decades that he knew had gotten out and committed suicide. And Red, at least in the movie, was in the same apartment that this other guy had been in, and, saw his initials scratched in the crossbeam in the ceiling. But yeah, I mean, he knew how to operate in prison. He had status. He had roots. He had a context that was intelligible to him. And outside, he had nothing. So yeah, that's familiar.
Yeah, good example.
The sci-fi story, though, that really ties into this, which is a lot of fun, is one by Margaret Atwood. And it's called The Heart is the Last to Go, I think, or The Heart Goes Last, something like that. And it's about this corporation that starts a town. And the town is a walled city. There's, walls all around it. And there's a prison inside. And everybody who lives in the town works for or in the prison in some capacity. Or if they're working outside, it's in a support role, running a restaurant for people who work at the prison or whatever. And everybody who, is doing jobs to support the prison, they have nice housing outside the prison. And then, of course, the people in the prison are in prison cells. But every month, the two populations trade places. And the people who were outside, working for the prison or servicing people who did, are now in prison. And it's just, the whole notion of like a rural prison economy town is so stable, but the only thing missing is, a reliable and compliant prison population to make it work. Everybody there is a volunteer. All the people in prison have volunteered to be there because life in the disintegrating economy outside the walls of this town is precarious, to put it mildly. Like the main couple that we're following, they had been a middle-class couple, but by the time the novel starts, they're living in their car and they have to sleep lightly because, several times a night they have to start it up and drive away quickly, to avoid people breaking in and pulling them out and doing terrible things to them. So, in that sort of, that milieu of utter barbarism, this this oasis, out in the countryside where you get to live in this nice house every other month and have a nice job like you used to have is very attractive. And the idea that you have to spend every other month as a prisoner is really, compared to the outside, no great sacrifice.
Oh, that is so interesting. I did just watch this video by Johnny Harris on YouTube about North Korea, and he did like a deep dive into what life is like in North Korea outside of Pyongyang. Because I guess like it's just like the high status people who are living in Pyongyang, like all of them are like the uber wealthy of that society. But like, so who lives out in the countryside? And it's all people who just live in the same place their entire lives. They go to the same factory every day and they go home and they sleep. And nobody has cars, so you can't leave at all. You can like take walks and stuff, but there's nowhere to walk. And so some people just like their whole lives, they make t-shirts. Some people like weld. Some people, I mean, and that's the whole entire society. You do one job your entire life and then you die. And man, like examples like that make me scared of any sort of a totalitarian state, just because for some reason, people who become totalitarians don't have much of like an imagination for how to run societies. They're not even clever enough to think about like, oh, 1 month out of the year or whatever, you get to live in a mansion or something. There's no imagination at all. It's just like, oh, you work the same job your entire life and then you die. It's like, that's what we need to avoid, I think. And situations like that do make me worried about any like Yarvin style society, just because it's too close to becoming North Korea, I think, at any level.
Well, North Korea is a very strange case. I saw a short documentary many years ago about eye doctors who got permission to go into North Korea because there's loads of people who are blind in North Korea whose blindness is easily curable, with modern medical technology. And inevitably, I mean, they would go and they would do the surgery and they would take the bandages off the eyes of these old people who had been blind for decades. And the first thing these people would do is they would praise the leader. They would say, "Thank you, glorious leader, for restoring my sight." The level of cult of personality in North Korea, particularly for people who have lived it their whole lives and really know nothing else, is very difficult for us to imagine. And it's not anything I think that you could impose on a population like that of the United States. Like I don't think there's any level of power that could transform the US into North Korea.
Oh, you're totally right. Yeah. Although we have it in ourselves. We totally have it in our DNA to love a strong leader. And not to bring up Trump again, but we have seen this at a level that I never thought was quite possible. Just like the level of idol worship that people have for Donald Trump. It goes above and beyond like anything that I would have ever imagined. It's like 30% of the population, but it's like, guys, really? Like, he's a human being. He's fallible. But for like 30% of the population, he's like not, which is to me just like blows my mind.
Well, I mean, I think they have to approve of whatever he does to validate their prior support of him.
Yes. Oh yeah. It is a little bit complicated. You're totally right.
Yeah, I mean, there's loads of people who they don't want America to be Israel's bitch. This is language I see online fairly often.
Mm-hmm.
But if Trump's behind it, there must be a reason. Mm-hmm. Like they're totally not down with, supporting Israel and its Gaza genocide. And yet until the glorious leader, says it's okay to object, they won't. It is, I mean, the last thing I want to talk about in this podcast is Israel. I just retract that whole segue. I mean, there's nothing I can say that I have a strong conviction for that won't piss people off unnecessarily, because there are two main positions on, at least among Americans, on Israel, and I don't hold either of them.
Oh, what position do you hold?
If it were up to me, if I were God Emperor of the United States, there would be no U.S.-Israeli dual citizenship. That would not be a thing. Mossad agents caught in the United States would be executed. I mean, I don't want to start using weird language because it's not anything that I used to think in, but Israel and the United States do not have a imperial patron-client relationship. The U.S. should be the patron. Israel, the sort of, not a proper colony, but a sort of colonial, like, proxy often a part of the world that we don't really care to be, that we need because of the oil, but which we don't really care to inhabit in a very personal, visceral way. It doesn't really seem to play out that way. It seems like the United States exists for Israel's convenience, and that this is the opinion of the Pentagon and of every president and every senator.
It is interesting that the United States doesn't even need the Middle East for oil anymore, because after the shale revolution, we're entirely self-sufficient in terms of oil. But our allies do. Like, all of Europe still gets like tons of their oil from the Middle East and natural gas. So I think that like there's also some of that, but I mean, this is like the Peter Zion take that I think is so fascinating, is that as globalization breaks down and we just, the United States is self-sufficient in North America with Canada and Mexico as our immediate allies. And we don't really need Europe to the extent that we used to, or the Middle East. I mean, we're in a unique position in that regard, but where everyone else in the world still like relies on globalization at a fundamental level to like operate. I mean, China imports like 70% of its food or something like that. And we're just not like that. We make all of our own food, we have all of our own energy. So we're kind of good. And so we are starting to step back from the world. I'm like more naturally pro-Israel, it sounds like, than you probably are. But at the same time, like, we don't need them. Like, you're totally right. We could just completely step back from the Middle East and we're good. And it seems like Trump is continuing that process of becoming more, isolating America from the rest of the world. And we're finding out that we're kind of like good in that regard. I mean, we need globalization to make our iPhones and to make, cars and a lot of things. It's not like Trump's vision of like, we're going to bring back manufacturing is insane, but and all the jobs that we'd ever bring back, we're just going to automate anyway. So there's it's kind of like, it's a weird vision that he has that's just satisfying like people who don't know much about how the economy works, in my opinion. But we're stepping back from the world, right? And like, there's gonna be a lot of implications for that, and a lot of those implications will touch the Middle East, in ways that I'm not even sure how exactly that plays out. But yeah, for sure, I think.
Well, as is natural in a conversation like this, we have drifted far from our charted course. Is there anything that we've discussed like in the last 15 minutes that we can steer back to the tension between Yarvin and Srinivasan, between, the chief executive of the United States wielding absolute power in order to produce a coherent result versus the high agency, high net worth people just going off and doing their own thing someplace else and leaving the rest of us to, get along as best we can?
Well, I think that I do want to say this, in that this was one conclusion I drew in my essay, was that the Yarvin style CEO type government is most valuable to people who are already in power, because it gives them a little bit of a playbook and like kind of a philosophical justification for seeking more power. So I think that it's most beneficial to them. Whereas I think that the Srinivasan view of having network states is actually possibly more valuable to like normies and people who aren't the ultra wealthy. I think that you're right that the ultra wealthy will use it to escape taxes and like have their little like mini societies that are wealth sustains it. But at the same time, like, the concept could really be taken advantage of by anyone. If you get 1,000 like-minded artists or writers and you all form a network online, that's a lot of people where everyone just like once a month donates $100 or whatever some figure might be, or maybe like 10,000 people, so $100 for every member is a decent amount of money. And then you could actually like start developing cool shit with that. And I think that like collective action is something that people have not taken advantage of with the internet in a way that is just like sitting there, like waiting for people to take advantage of it at some level, especially like artists could, I think, really take advantage of this. And I don't know. So I think that like normies should like us and like normal, not uber wealthy people should think about the network state and see how to harness the concept of it. Even if our goal isn't to create a government, if our goal is just to maybe create a cool art collective where once a year you gather in LA to like hang out and do cool shit. You know what I mean? Like there's power in numbers, and there's power in a vision that people collectively have. And I think that if there's some sort of digital infrastructure that's there, and it kind of is there already, people should take advantage of that. And I think that there's definitely room for more conversation to happen in that regard.
Yeah, when you talk about a network state, though, I mean, we already have social networks, and we have globally networked tribes, of people with overlapping interests and shared heritage, things like that. But when you invoke the notion of a state has authority like no other institution. It supposedly, in its locale, controls a monopoly on violence.
Mm-hmm.
It can dispossess you of your property and call it, taxes, and say this is what is in order to enjoy the benefits of living in this style of social organization, you will pay this much. And if you don't pay up, we will just come and take it. So a state is something rather different from what I took you to be describing, particularly things where artists and writers get together and, base their activities on their shared commitments to creativity and liberal values or whatever. A state, as George Washington said, was the exact quote, that the government is like fire. It is a fearful master and a dangerous tool, or I think in reverse order. So there's just a lot more hard edge to a state than I think what you're describing.
This is opening a little bit of a can of worms, but I actually started an essay. It became a little boring, so I'm not going to finish it probably, but I started an essay on why network states just won't work. And this was actually the reason, in that you would have to have some sort of a military. And I do know that Srinivasan has talked about this a little bit, but nobody who signs up to be part of a network state wants to wield military power in that regard. It would just be taken over by any government. It just would be. The second a government wanted to take over their assets, they would find a way to do it, and no one's gonna care or stop them. I don't know. They would not be able to harness enough state-like power to ward off pirates and other states coming after them, I think. So at the end of the day, I do think that is a huge weakness for the network state concept. If they were ever to try to actually become a state, it would just be too open to piracy, too open to other states coming after them, I think.
How does the existence of Singapore square with what you've just argued?
Good point. And I think it's because they tapped themselves into so many local economies that the region relies on them in a lot of different ways. So maybe that would be the way that a network state could hedge against other powers, is to become integral with other states, and they're providing resources in some regard that they need, or something like that.
Have you been to Singapore?
Oh, I'd love to, but no, I never have.
I've only ever been in the airport, but even the airport is otherworldly. I mean, this was at the turn of the century too, but even then it was super high tech and just luxurious beyond imagining, really. And particularly, coming from Thailand. But there's a sort of dull-eyed, cultural conservatism at work in Singapore that I find repulsive. Now, I know that people who live within spitting distance of Singapore, in places like Indonesia and Malaysia and the Philippines, they look at Singapore like heaven. You if you're a good person, you die and you go to Singapore, because
it looks glorious. I mean, it really does.
I'm a lifelong curmudgeon on the topic of the drug war, and Singapore is just the absolute worst.
Yes, I know. Yeah. That's a very, very, very good point. I know. Yeah.
But at the same time, their system is clean, it's orderly, it's shiny and new, and everything works.
And the crazy thing is that it should not have been that way. Historically, it was not set up to have that future. It really was the vision of Lee Kuan Yew that brought that about. It should be still to this day kind of like a backwater of a state that's just floundering, but it's totally not. So yeah, I mean, total props to that vision of Lee Kuan Yew and being able to execute it.
Now, I do think that Singapore doesn't really work without imperial America. Without the United States able to project force in that part of the world, I think Singapore just becomes part of Indonesia or Malaysia overnight.
Yes. Oh, you're right. No, you're totally, yeah.
And that, the United States is utterly committed to the independence and continued thriving of Singapore because of the Strait of Malacca there. All the oil going to Japan from the Gulf states, all the oil going to China, it's all got to go through there. That's that place has got to stay open. I mean, the Chinese are scrambling to build overland routes to transport, fossil fuel energy from the Gulf states to China. And it's, to describe it as a Herculean task would be to underplay it. It is such a huge task. Whereas, the methodology of transporting that same oil over the ocean is, it's been working for decades. We understand it, but there are critical choke points. And one of them is at Singapore's front door. So the US is going to be parked there in perpetuity with, great commitment, regardless of, which faction is in power here in the homeland.
And it would be harder to have a superpower care that much about a semi-rogue-ish network state that's not contributing to the global economy, right? Like that's kind of how I see it.
Right. Particularly a bunch of hippies who set up a commune in New Zealand.
Yes, exactly.
The empire does not care. This is a bit of a segue, but I think we have George Lucas to thank for the fact that empire is synonymous with evil in the contemporary imagination. And, Andor with Tony Gilroy has gone and just doubled down on that, and illustrated just how reprehensible the empire is, in ways that George Lucas never even imagined. But empires are supranational organizations which tend to quell a lot of conflict, because the conflict would be between imperial client states, and the empire's like, no, you settle this or we'll settle it.
Mm-hmm.
Which tends to produce more peace and prosperity than a warring state situation. So, there was the United States is not a declared empire. It's not a formal empire. We don't have an emperor. We don't describe our less powerful allies as colonial clients or imperial clients. But, functionally, in terms of exerting that dampening influence over what would otherwise be, a lot of international rivalry, which breaks out into violence. The United States doesn't like to refer to itself as an empire. And if you call it an empire, then a lot of patriotic people will sort of push back at that and explain all the ways that it's not an empire. And I'm just fine with it being an empire because I know how shitty things would get without it, or if it was replaced by any of the plausible rivals. China or Russia as the new global hegemon with the military reach that the US has. I don't want to live in that world.
Yeah, it's almost like we need a new term because there is so much baggage to the term empire, and a term that means a globally integrated military and economy that doesn't want to necessarily expand its borders, but wants to maintain global order. What's the word for that?
Well, that's what the word empire used to mean.
Yeah, you're right. Yeah. Although the old empires, they used to want to expand their borders. They used to want to I guess apparently we want to take over Canada. So maybe that is still us. Who knows? In Greenland, watch out, everybody.
I could see Alberta just petitioning to join the United States on its own. And if it does, and it takes, Canada's fossil fuel resources with it, then Canada as a working nation kind of disintegrates. And most of it would be incorporated into the United States over time. But if you just put the proposition on the table, hey, Canadians, you want to be Americans? The answer is an emphatic no. Absolutely not. And gosh, who wants that? Who wants to force that sort of integration? I don't even think Donald Trump does. I think he's just being provocative.
Yeah, I think that you're right. Republicans would lose all power because Canadians are so much more liberal than Americans. But Canada is funny because their whole identity is based on referring to themselves in terms of America. I have a friend who, I grew up right across the border from Canada, so I've been there a million times. But a lot of friends of mine went to school up in Canada, and they've told me that in history classes, they always learn about America first, and then Canada history as a footnote, which is so funny. And then they know more about America than we do at some level.
Yeah, I have great compassion for my Canadian brothers and sisters, largely because when I was podcasting more regularly, a disproportionate chunk of the audience was Canadian, more than one would expect.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. And it was the C Realm podcast, so I would sometimes joke that C stood for Canada. But in the same breath, I would also belittle Canada and say, "Oh, isn't that cute? They think they're a separate country."
Yeah, I know.
Isn't that adorable?
It kind of sort of is like Little America at some level.
Yeah. All right. Well, we've been going for an hour and 8 minutes. I think file size consideration and also the fact that it is sweltering in here and you probably have things to do. we should wrap it up. But as always, I'd like to give the guest the last word. So put a bow on it.
Well, I do think that right now it is actually an important thing to start learning about concepts like the network state and the Curtis Yarvin style CEO run government, because I do think that over the next 25, 50 years, a lot of the things that we've just like relied on as normal in terms of like government functioning, it's gonna just break and become completely outmoded as AI becomes, more of a powerful player in terms of like running things. So I think that like we need to be, I mean, I'm like a normie lib, like through and through to my core, sadly. But even I recognize that I don't think that the Constitution or, I mean, anything that we think is like sacred, I don't think it is sacred. I think that we need to, with a vision for how to orient ourselves in the future by harnessing technology so that more people benefit and less people suffer. We should keep an open mind about these things and not like let the ick factor of them necessarily overwhelm us. If the ick factor is the first thing that you feel when you're like confronted with Curtis Yarvin and his messy hair, if your first factor is like ick, just pull back for half a second and give it the time of day, just for the fact that like the world is changing at a rapid pace, and we need new ideas. I think to at least just be floating around in the ether as we navigate our way into the future.
So you're a left upwinger.
Oh, that's good. Yeah, FM 2030 reference there.
Although he wasn't left, but there are certainly, I mean, that's the new abundance meme. What's his name? Klein and Thompson, they wrote that book that, for the most part, the tech positive sort of accelerationist vision is held on the Silicon Valley right now. And, just denouncing artificial intelligence and saying how much you hate it seems to be a kind of de rigueur in parts of the left that I cross paths with. I mean, I know that, there are Marxists who think that, we had the technology in 1970 to automate all work and that people could just live in perpetual luxury. But I think that's a minority position on the left. I think right now, techno-skepticism and the association with people like, Peter Thiel or Elon Musk is a far more dominant sort of psychological strain. So happy to talk to somebody who breaks ranks with that.
Yeah, absolutely. Zoran Mamdani, the guy who just won the Democratic ticket in New York for mayor, he's a big fan of the Ezra Klein, Derek Thompson abundance agenda. And he talks about that very openly, even though like his constituency isn't a huge fan. So yeah, props to him for that.
I'd be more encouraged to hear that he was a fan of E&M Banks.
Okay, fair enough.
All right. Well, Peter Clarke, it is always fun talking to you.
Okay, thanks so much. Yeah, that was a lot of fun.
All right, that was Peter Clarke, and I didn't hold any back for the behind the paywall section, so there's the whole conversation. I hope you enjoyed it. All right, stay well.